Hello, this is the last of a set of 4 videos on the expansion of Imperial Russia in East Asia, taking the story from 1895 up to the start of the war with Japan in 1904. For ease of recording, I've split the video into 2 parts. From relative non-involvement in East Asia, Russian policy towards the region underwent a sea change in the 1890s. First, in 1891, Alexander III announced the project to build the Trans-Siberian Railway to link European Russia with the Russian port of Vladivostok on the Sea of Japan. Second, in 1895, in the aftermath of Japan's victory over China in the Sino-Japanese War, Nicholas II and his government decided that Russia would oppose any territorial gains by Japan on the Asian mainland, quickly implementing that decision by intervening decisively to block projected Japanese gains in Manchuria, and in the process placing the Chinese government massively in Russia's debt. From this point onwards, Russia adopted a far more assertive policy in East Asia, the working out of this policy leading fairly directly to the war between Russia and Japan that began in 1904. The Russian-led denial of Japanese gains in southern Manchuria was soon followed by a momentous agreement in 1896, when Russia gained Chinese approval to build a shortcut to the Trans-Siberian Railway through northern Manchuria, from Chita to Vladivostok. This would provide the Russians with a shorter and quicker route to their naval base than the as yet uncompleted long loop through Russian territory north of the Manchurian border, saving around 1,000 miles and going through relatively easy countryside for railway building. At the same time, Russia agreed to defend China in the event of any further war with Japan, and the Chinese gave permission to the Russians to use several of their ports in the event of any war. Work on what became known as the China Eastern Railway began in 1897 and was substantially completed in 1901, marking the joining of the Russian Far East to the rest of the country. It was a vital link in securing Russian power in East Asia and strengthening its naval base at Vladivostok. The northern loop, entirely through Russian territory, was not completed until 1916. Significantly, whilst the treaty gave China the right to eventually purchase the Manchurian line, the China Eastern Railway was initially treated as an extension of Russia, manned by Russians and guarded by Russian troops, and a substantially Russian new town growing up at Harbin, at the railway's hub. Russia also now became increasingly involved in events in Korea, a country of interest to both the Japanese and Russians. Now that Chinese influence in what had previously been a Chinese vassal state had formally ended, the Japanese had expected that they would be able to exercise an informal dominance over the country, but instead found themselves opposed by an assertive Russian presence. For the Russians, a friendly state to the immediate south of Vladivostok would be beneficial. Korea was only a short distance away, they had a short shared border, and there was the hope of securing port facilities in Korea to create another ice-free port, Vladivostok being icebound for part of each year. Japanese assertiveness also initially helped the Russians, many Korean nationalists seeing the Russians as a potential counterweight to the sometimes overbearing Japanese. This was most obvious in October 1895, when the Japanese representative in Korea organized the murder of Queen Min, seen as a major opponent of Japanese domination, and then forced the king to issue a statement completely identifying himself with Japanese aims for the country. In February 1896, however, the Korean king escaped from his palace and took refuge in the Russian legation, issuing a proclamation to announce his freedom and being visited by his ministers and foreign diplomats. Japanese influence thereupon rapidly sank. A subsequent joint Russian-Japanese agreement effectively recognized Korean independence, whilst accepting that both powers had interests in the country. As with China and Japan prior to the Sino-Japanese War, neither side could dominate Korea. Moreover, the influence of other powers had to be considered, as the Russians were reminded in 1897, when their representative tried to remove the British head of customs, only to have to back down when British ships arrived and briefly occupied a Korean island as an assertion of potential force. Meanwhile, the situation in China was destabilized by the German seizure of the Chinese port of Tsingtao in November 1897. 1 month later, in December, the Russians seized Port Arthur as their compensation for this move, later followed by the French and British each taking control of a selected Chinese port. In the case of Port Arthur, the Russians forced the Chinese to reluctantly agree to a 25-year lease on the strategic southern Liaotong Peninsula and allow them to build a spur to their developing railway to link Port Arthur in the south to Harbin in the north, a line later known as the Southern Manchuria Railway, another very important strategic line for the Russians. Possession of Port Arthur, Lushun in Chinese, gave the Russians a second base for their Pacific fleet, which, unlike Vladivostok, was not closed by ice in wintertime. It also gave them control over the maritime approach to Tientsin and thus to Beijing. Construction work on the branch line between Port Arthur and Harbin began in 1898 and was completed by 1903, giving Russia strategic and economic dominance over the whole of Chinese Manchuria. I will continue this story in the second part of the video. Thank you.